Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, a realistic path to 100K. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. I wanted to provide a video where we can discuss again a realistic path to $100,000. Obviously, right now, retail investment sentiment is absolutely destroyed because of missing the mark in 2021. But I do want to show why I think that $100,000 is still coming before the next halving. Okay. Now, if you're new here, I will just spend like about 1 minute explaining why I think we could still see higher prices over the next year or two, and we don't have to wait for the next halving. One of the things we can look at is the timing of market cycles and the idea that they do tend to elongate, they lengthen every single time. This is not something that's just taken from crypto. Lengthening cycles is something that we can see in many other markets as well. And the reason we talk about it is just simply the idea of looking at these cycles and realizing that they lengthen every single time. And of course, it's somewhat subjective, which I completely agree with. This is a common criticism of the idea of a market cycle to begin with, is that it is somewhat subjective to say the least. And I know some people that would say consider this to be a separate market cycle than that one. Okay, and so what I would say here is that I understand the subjectivity to the idea of a market cycle. I completely understand. And if you don't want to think about it like that, you can always think about it a different way. I mean, what the natural evolution of lengthening cycles and diminishing returns is that eventually the cycles will no longer look like cycles, but they'll just be some version of the stock market where you just get some, you get some natural volatility, and it'll be harder and harder to distinguish one cycle from another. With that said, I still do think we will see higher prices later on this cycle without having to wait for the next halving. And I think that's the key distinguishing factor. There's a lot of people that now assume that because we didn't hit the lofty price targets that were put out in 2021, that now we have to wait until 2024 or 2025 to see those price targets met. And while they could be right, I mean, there's certainly a chance that the idea of a 6 to 9K top for the next, say, 3 to 4 years, that could be a possibility. I want to talk about why I think we still have higher prices to come over the next couple of years without having to wait for the next halving. So the first thing to look at is just looking at the idea that each cycle, if you do buy into the subjectivity of market cycles, does tend to lengthen in time. This one's approximately 50 weeks. This one's approximately 100 weeks, give or take a few weeks, right? 46, 107. Of course, it depends on exactly where you measure it from. And then this one being around 150 weeks. So the general idea here is that you see each cycle sort of expand out by approximately 50 weeks or about 1 year, And a lot of people have assumed that this cycle has to see a peak by the end of 2021. And look, in the short term, there is a chance that 69K was the market cycle top, and we will not see higher prices for 3 years. Okay, there is a chance. But I still think that the probability is much higher that Bitcoin will ultimately have higher prices before the next halving, and you'll see it lengthen out either late into 2022, okay, or even into 2023. All right, this has been my argument all along. If you go back and watch my videos from 2019, 2020, I always said I thought these major market cycle peaks would come in the sense of 2011, 2013, 2017, and 2023 was what I dubiously speculated back then, and clearly we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I would argue that late 2022 is certainly a possibility as well. Okay, and I should say that this is not just something that we've pivoted to because the previous theory did not work out. I was adamant for the entirety of 2021 that we would likely not see $100,000 in 2021. And it was not a popular theory at all, right? This was not a popular theory to have in 2021 that 100,000 would not come to pass. But here we are, right? We're in 2022. We have not hit 100K. Furthermore, everyone is super bearish and investor sentiment is destroyed, and we're still only 2.5x away from 100K. Now, let that sink in for a minute. I know some people might say 2.5x is a lot, right? I mean, you're talking about going 2x up from here would get us to 82, 83K, and it's hard to imagine a 2x at this point when Bitcoin's just in a fairly prolonged downtrend, okay? I think something that investors have a hard time with is when prices are going down, we have a hard time imagining them ever going back up again. But when prices are going up, we always have a hard time imagining them ever going back down again. And so I do think we will make it there. I just think we need time. I think time is in fact on our side, even if in the short term we have more downside volatility. All right. So when diving into this a little bit further, I want to talk about where we are today and what I'm looking at. All right. So the best case scenario, obviously at this point, is the idea that the hold the line conjecture stands the test of time. Okay. And if you're not familiar with that one, it is basically the idea that once Bitcoin holds the line at the 20-week SMA, it doesn't mean we can't go below that price, or it doesn't mean we can't go below the 20-week SMA again. Obviously, it just means that we have historically held the line at that level, right? At the level we have not gone below it, right? You can see a time here when we held the line at around $3,000, and then we ultimately held it, about a year later or so, a little over a year later. And you can go back throughout the entire history of Bitcoin and see the same thing play out, right? Once we hold the line, we have not before gone below that level. Now, with that said, I do not want to make the claim that 40K has to hold. I would like for it to hold, but I don't want to make the claim that it has to, because I don't think it absolutely has to for this thing to play out. And one of the reasons is I don't think that what really happens here over the next few months is going to be that important. Whether we come back down to say, whether we hold the line at 40K and bounce here, whether we go down to say 35K and bounce, or if we have some type of major capitulation and we come down here and then come up and then we're off to the races. I don't really think either of those three scenarios, while they all seem like, one's better than the other, I think they more or less all get us to the same place that we're going. And even if we do bounce here off 40K, it doesn't mean we can't come back down and retest it. It doesn't mean we can't go back down below it later. But the whole point is to say we're at a phase right now where, Q1 still remains relatively bearish. We are below the 20-week SMA right now, and we know that sentiment by investors is pretty bad when Bitcoin's below its bull market support band. And you might as well think about it as a bear market resistance band until we get back above it, right? And this was the same case over here back in the summer. One thing that I think people have a hard time thinking about is the idea of one consecutive mania phase that has to last the entirety of a cycle, when in reality, that's not actually true. It was more or less true in 2017, where we just saw a single parabolic rally for the most part, that we just put on our rally caps and then rode that thing for as long as we could. But we've also seen before in prior cycles, we saw Bitcoin actually drop 70% once and still put in a new all-time high later that year. And I still think a lot of people would look back at this and say this was all one cycle, considering how we didn't really go into this long bear market right here like we did up in this region. So one of the things I think we can look at is to say, and to try to distinguish between what would separate this from being the same cycle or say being a different cycle, would be to go back to say the fair value. And this is a logarithmic regression curve fitted to all data. And the whole idea is, as long as we're above the fair value band, or at least inside of it, we can still be inside the fair value band. As long as we're not coming down below it, then I think you can make the case that we're in the same cycle and that there still is a chance that we'll have another rally ahead of us. If you go look over here, you can see that once we go below it, we tend to enter into this long reaccumulation phase that can last at least a year or so. All right, and you saw that over here as well. We got into this long reaccumulation range. We don't, once you break below, you're likely not going to see a immediate recovery like that. Okay, what's more likely, I think, at that point is you get this long accumulation phase to build into the next mania phase. And in this cycle, what you'll notice is that we had a rally in 2019 that took us up to the top of this band. We got rejected. We came back down, back up. Support, got somewhat supported off of it back here in July, and then now we're testing it again at about $10,000 higher. Now, it would be, I think, the best case scenario to get to 100K in the short term, of course, would be for us to just hold 40K. But the reason why I think that we need to be a little bit flexible on that is we know that it could still come down and test the summer lows. And if it comes back up, I still think you could look at this as just one continuous cycle, in which case we went sideways for about 1 year before seeing newer, higher prices. We've seen that in crypto before. Ethereum in 2016 went sideways between $8 to $16 for an entire year before it broke out. And we all look back at that and say that it was just a single market cycle. So with this in mind, what I'm looking for here is to just say, in the short term, the market does seem relatively bearish, but we have a hard time imagining prices going up when we're in a downtrend, okay? And my argument is that while it seems really bad right now at the beginning of 2022, I do think by the end of 2022, I don't think we necessarily have to wait for the end of 2022 for good times, but I would say by the end of 2022 and in 2023, we'll probably look back and I'm hoping we'll see this as a key time to accumulate Bitcoin during this time, in with the idea that we're heading to much higher prices before having to wait till the next halving. So one thing I wanted to mention as well is that in order to get to 100K, we first need to break the downtrend, obviously, right? We need to break this downtrend. And it's going to be a battle, all right? So I wanted to kind of talk about how we get there. First of all, one of the things we know is that whenever we tend to break the all-time highs, except for this instance, when we actually more or less had at least a double top locally, when we normally break the all-time highs, we normally just go parabolic in the short term, right? Like here's an example, and then we just went parabolic. And so one of the things that would be interesting, I think, in terms of thinking a route to $100,000, is that once we break this level, once we break sort of that $70,000 level, and whether we go up now and get there by Q2, whether we have to capitulate a little bit longer and then get up there by, say, Q3 or sometime by the end of the year, this is what I'm more or less looking at in terms of just getting back to the prior all-time high, okay? And once we get there, I do think things can move relatively quickly at that point, okay? I think that the market can, if once we pass that all-time high, I think we can move relatively quickly. And furthermore, one of the theory of lengthening cycles and diminishing returns that we put out, in 2019 is that I do think we will reach $100,000 to $200,000 by late 2022 at the earliest, but potentially going into 2023. But that I don't think the peak is at 100K. I actually think that once we get to 100K, that's when a lot of the retail will come back into the space. They'll wait for that nice round number. It'll make the news again. Bitcoin's at 100K. All the retail will come swarming back, and then we'll see some type of mania phase somewhere between $100,000 to $200,000. And maybe, depending on how long it takes for us to get there, maybe it'll go above 200K. But with the idea of diminishing returns, I am struggling to at least plan for that. All right, I wouldn't plan for it going over $200,000 that early. So, this is one of those things that, when we talked about this back in early 2021, it certainly wasn't popular. And it was, the idea of lengthening cycles was more or less ridiculed because we were already trading at 60K by March and April of 2021. And so the idea that we would just need to go sideways for a long period of time and not immediately go to 100K was certainly not well received. And now I think we're sort of paying the price, to be completely honest, right? I think that there was a lot of hype around Bitcoin going to 200K, 300K by the end of 2021, which, as I said many times, I did not see the evidence for it. If you go look at the logarithmic regression bands for Bitcoin, which we showed many, many times, this, we came into it right here. As I said before, we need to go down for 3 to 6 months. We need at least 3 to 6 months below the 20-week SMA to support all of this mania that we've gone into. We did spend only 3 months below it. Now we're spending more time below it. And right now, if you're curious, the upper part of the regression band is already at $121,000. One of the reasons I was so skeptical back here going to 100K is because the top of the regression band, which has held pretty strong resistance in the past, wasn't even at 100K. Now the top of the regression band is over 120K, right? It's over 120K. And so I look at this cycle as starting here. You came up, we came all the way back down. We came up to the top, but we didn't go into it, back down. We're sort of spending some time in no man's land, and we're going to continue spending some time in no man's land. And then eventually, I think we'll come up and we'll put in some market cycle peak, much later on, and then I think we'll get some probably bear market, like some longer bear market than what I think we are experiencing now. Okay, and one of the things too that if I could just be candid with people. People always ask me if this is a bull market or this is a bear market. And I think it's a hard question to answer because everyone's definition of a bull market and a bear market is different, right? I mean, some people wouldn't even look at 2019 and call it a bull market, right? They would just say it was a scam move by Bitcoin. But in actuality, Bitcoin went up more than 4x in a relatively short period of time. To me, if my investment can go up 4x in 5 months, that's a bull market, right? That's a bull market. But on the same side, if my investment can drop 55% in say a month or two, I wouldn't consider that a bull market, right? So there's this big nuance between what is a bull market and what is a bear market, and I think part of it is this mentality of recency bias of people who've experienced the last market cycle, and they can only think of it in terms of one long bull market and then one long bear market. But in this current cycle, because I think again it's going to be extremely long, one of the things that we've seen multiple bull markets. We saw a mini bull market here, and I mean, still 4x is still a lot. I mean, to think about that, a 4x from this point, the market cap is higher, so it's hard to go up 4x. But even if we went up 3x from here, that would get us to 100K. So don't discount the importance of a 3 to 4x move in the market, okay? So we had a mini bull market, and then we had a mini bear market, and then we had a more insane bull market, and then we had another mini bear market. This one was not really that exciting of a bull market, but it was there, right? We went up about 2x or so, and then we're back into at least a mini bear market. I don't consider it to be a year-long crypto winter. If that's what I don't think we have to go down for a year and then sideways for a year and then finally we'll put in new all-time highs by the time 2024, 2025 rolls around. I don't think that's the case. But I mean, of course anything's possible. What I think right now is we're sort of in this bearish phase, and we'll be in it a little bit longer, and then eventually, we'll come out of it, and then we'll have another rally. And we'll try to, we'll make that run to 100K, whether it happens now, or whether we have to wait a little longer. The key distinguishing thing is I don't think that we need to, come all the way back down here. I don't think Bitcoin needs to go back down to say $12,000 and then spend time down here for 2 years before then coming back up. I think that's the biggest distinguishing factor between this theory and the people that have sort of thrown in the towel on reaching 100K because it didn't happen in 2021. And so now they just say, oh, well, we have to wait until the next halving, right? So the next halving is going to be somewhere way out here. And so I think they're thinking that we just have to come all the way back down and then spend time in this band for a while before we can actually see a sustained move to the upside. I would argue that the importance of the halving will have less and less effect as time goes on. Okay, and I've said this before. If anything, you could even argue that Bitcoin is only twice its prior all-time high, right? It's not 20 times its prior all-time high. Of course, there is the idea of diminishing returns, but it's not even 5 times its prior all-time high. It's not even 3 times the prior all-time high right now, right? We're twice the prior all-time high. And we've seen the evidence for lengthening cycles in the data that already exists. We know that Bitcoin has just basically been going sideways for over about a year now. It's just been going sideways between 30 and 60K. And so if we either bounce here at 40K or we have to come back down to the bottom and then bounce, I don't think it really makes a huge difference in the route that Bitcoin is taking, in my opinion, to $100,000. So What is a realistic path? I think a realistic path is for us to continue spending Q1 and potentially Q2, trying to claw our way out of the mess that we're currently in, and then later on in 2022, and even potentially going into 2023 to seeing new highs and Bitcoin making a run at that elusive six-figure milestone. One thing that I think is interesting is you could argue in one sense that the stage has been set for 100K for a long time. And I've thought about this before, but basically you have this whole, flock of investors that operate in a very black and white manner, in that it's either going to go up for a couple years or it's going to go down for a couple years. And it's almost like you have these investors that have PTSD that experienced this peak over here in 2017, and they can't even imagine anything other than just going down for a year or a year and a half, because that's what happened last time. One thing to remember, though, is that if these investors who sort of buy into the idea that we have to wait until 2024 before we see any type of further run up, what happens if these investors see that the Bitcoin is actually coming back up to this all-time high in late 2022 or early 2023? What happens then? I think maybe they come back into the market and then they help fuel the rally to get us higher. But you should remember that when that time comes, if that time comes, there will be another parabolic mania phase in that type of environment, and then we probably would still come back down. Okay, so I don't want to give people the idea that we only are ever going to go up forever. I think that if you zoom out here on Bitcoin's chart, you can see that it more or less, we just kind of bounce between these lines. And sometimes we spend more time in no man's land. Sometimes we don't really spend a whole lot of time in it. And so far this cycle, we have spent a lot of time in no man's land, which is between the green and red regression bands. And so now, I think we're going to spend many more months in no man's land in this region, not all the way out here. But we're probably going to spend more time in this region, and then hopefully eventually get that run up to 100K. And then at that point, I imagine we will, or even above 100K. And then at that point, I do imagine we will have some type of longer bear market that will probably get us more so for the longer haul into the bottom of this regression band. And we'll spend a lot of time there, and then we'll continue along the way. So I know this is very dubious speculation, but again, that's what we do here. Because this video has gone on for a long period of time, why not make it even longer? One of the things we can look at too is this corridor that we've looked at before, and the idea that it did do a pretty good job of identifying the bottom. All right, before it doesn't mean we have to go to the down here again, but look, we created this indicator back over here. It did a fairly good job of calling this bottom. If you're curious, right now it's between 33 and 34K. All right, so doesn't mean we have to go there. We've definitely, seen times where we don't go there, especially not immediately. So if we bounce back up like this and this curves back up, maybe we go there, but we go there later on. I don't really know. But that is where that one is. And if we go look at, say, the last one I wanted to talk about was the market cycles, and then show the time frame here. And then I got to zoom out so that you guys can see it. And this is basically just overlaying every market cycle from the market cycle bottom. Okay. And the whole idea here is, look, like every cycle extended out significantly. And so I still think that even if we spend more time in this region down here, we'll still probably see some type of expanded cycle, elongated cycle, lengthening cycles, right? Lengthening cycles. And that eventually we will come back down. That's what I'm thinking. Again, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's the thing we've been saying since 2019. And if that were to play out, I wanted to draw your attention to something that might be the most compelling evidence, or one of the most compelling evidence, is you look at this on a linear scale. All right, look at this on a linear scale. Imagine you experienced cycle 1. And you saw this parabolic rally. And then you had the insight to say, well, if it happened once, it'll happen again. And then in cycle 2, you're like, oh, well, it hasn't done anything. Maybe Bitcoin is just going to zero, right? Well, if you had done that, you would have missed out on the parabolic rally that came later on, right? You would have missed out. Now, if you experience cycle 1 and cycle 2, or if you just experienced cycle 2, you probably would have assumed at the time that we should have seen a parabolic rally in the last cycle a lot earlier than we did, potentially a full year earlier than we did, but we didn't. And if you had sold all of your Bitcoin or assumed that we had to wait for another 3 years to get back into a cycle, you would have missed out on the rally that eventually came. In the same manner, in the same exact manner, okay? In the current cycle that we're in down here, you can barely distinguish it off the x-axis. It's this one down here. The entirety of what most people in 2021 experienced is that cycle there that is barely distinguishable when comparing it to other cycles. So, if you were an investor who experienced the last cycle and you assumed that the major final parabolic rally of Bitcoin had to occur at the same time it happened in the last cycle, and then you just left Bitcoin for 3 years to come back, what would have happened? What I'm thinking is that you would have missed the parabolic rally that came later on. And I don't know exactly when it's going to come. I just think that people are so set in their ways. And a lot of it, I believe, is recency bias and the idea that they think that just because Bitcoin went 4 years last cycle, it has to go exactly 4 years this cycle. That's not true. I think it's recency bias. I think that we have quite a long way to go this market cycle. But in the short term, I understand everyone's sentiment. I understand why people are bearish. A lot of the structural components that you would look for in a cycle have sort of broken down. For instance, holding that 50-week moving average is something that we have fallen below. Okay, so clearly I know people are bearish about that. This 50-week SMA, I'm sure, will offer some form of resistance as well. But one way to look at this, as I mentioned before, is if you think about this entire cycle as starting from 2018, once upon a time we went above the 50-week, we came back down to it, we got a bounce, we then capitulated below it, and then we got right back above it and then continued on. So I'm just saying, like, we came back down to the 50-week, we got a bounce, we came back down to it, we fell below it. Now, are we looking for some type of capitulation where we then bounce and then get back above it and then continue on? This is what we're looking for. This is what I'm looking for. I think that the other issues that Bitcoin is facing right now, which is making it even worse and harder to navigate, is the fact that the stock market, the Nasdaq, the S&P, they've been under a lot of pressure recently. They've been selling off some. You can see the Nasdaq here has been selling off. The S&P has been selling off, and the dollar has also been generally moving up over late 2021 and early 2020, or actually it's been coming down a little bit in early 2022. But it was in fact this double bottom that made me skeptical of Bitcoin getting to 100K in 2021, right? I said that, look, we're sort of holding the line the same place we did in 2018. And if we move up here for a while, it's going to inhibit Bitcoin going to 100K immediately. If you think about this and you look at this and say, well, we can't go up until the dollar starts to come down like this again, do draw your attention to 2019 when the dollar started to slowly move higher, and it did not stop Bitcoin in 2019 from going up 4x. Okay, so my argument is that if you had trouble with the terminology of a cycle, of a market cycle, if you think it's just a bunch of, garbage that we just made up, that's completely fine. I understand there is subjectivity to it. My point is, I do think Bitcoin will go to $100,000 to $200,000 before the next halving. I don't think we have to wait until 2024. And I do think that is the key thing that distinguishes the idea of a lengthened cycle from just calling it a completely separate cycle that would then probably take us much higher. All right. But in order to get higher, we'd have to wait a lot longer just to get there. So what am I looking for? I'm looking for $100,000 to $200,000 Bitcoin before the next halving. Okay. And I do think that we'll see much better times for Bitcoin in 2022 and even going into potentially 2023. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. We do have the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com, and I will see you next time. Bye.